My name is Timothy Walsh, and in 1964, I was a 23-year-old white college student at the University of Mississippi when I fell in love with a woman who would cost me everything I thought mattered: my family, my inheritance, my social standing, and my place in the only community I had ever known. Her name was Josephine Williams, and she was the most intelligent, courageous, and beautiful person I had ever met. She was also black, which, in Mississippi during the height of the civil rights movement, made our relationship not just socially unacceptable, but literally life-threatening. What I couldn't have anticipated was that the greatest danger to our love wouldn't come from the Ku Klux Klan, violent segregationists, or even the police. It would come from my own family, who would ultimately disown me completely, rather than accept that their son had chosen love over the racial prejudices that had defined the Walsh family for generations. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, in a family that considered itself enlightened by Southern standards, but was deeply committed to maintaining the racial hierarchy that had shaped our society since Reconstruction. My father, Patrick Walsh, was a successful attorney who represented many of the state's most prominent families and businesses, while my mother, Catherine, was active in charitable organizations that helped deserving white families, while ignoring the systemic poverty that affected black communities throughout Mississippi. Our comfortable colonial home was maintained by black domestic workers who were treated with paternalistic kindness, but were never considered social equals or fully human beings worthy of genuine respect and consideration. The comfortable world of my upbringing began to crack when I started attending classes at the University of Mississippi in 1962, just months after James Meredith had integrated the institution amid riots and federal intervention. The campus was still tense with racial hostility, and most white students treated the few black students with open contempt or studied indifference. But my literature classes, particularly those dealing with American writers who had addressed issues of race and social justice, began to challenge the assumptions I had absorbed throughout my sheltered childhood about the natural order of racial relationships. My awakening to the realities of racial injustice accelerated when I began working part-time at the university library, where I had access to books, newspapers, and magazines that presented perspectives on civil rights that were completely absent from the conservative media and social circles that had shaped my understanding of current events. Reading accounts of the Freedom Riders, the Birmingham Campaign, and the ongoing struggle for voting rights in Mississippi forced me to confront the violence and systematic oppression that maintained the comfortable white supremacy I had taken for granted throughout my privileged upbringing. The moment that changed everything occurred in the spring of 1964, when I was studying late in the library and encountered a young black woman who was struggling to access research materials that were supposedly available to all students, but were often made difficult for black students to obtain through various forms of bureaucratic harassment. Josephine Williams was a graduate student in education who was conducting research on literacy programs in rural Mississippi, and she was being systematically obstructed by library staff who claimed that the materials she needed were unavailable or restricted. "Excuse me," I said, approaching her table where she sat surrounded by incomplete research materials and obvious frustration. "But I couldn't help noticing that you seem to be having trouble getting the sources you need. Maybe I can help. I work here part-time and know where some of the restricted materials are kept." Her response was initially suspicious, understandably wary of a white student who might be offering help with ulterior motives or who might be testing her in some way that could get her in trouble with university authorities. "I appreciate the offer," Josephine replied carefully, "but I've learned that accepting help from white students often creates more problems than it solves. I'll find another way to get what I need." Her caution was completely justified given the hostile environment that black students faced at the University of Mississippi, but something about her dignified refusal to accept help that might compromise her position made me even more determined to find a way to assist her research without creating additional difficulties. The conversation that followed was my first real interaction with a black person as an intellectual equal, rather than in the servant-master dynamic that had characterized all my previous relationships with black individuals. Josephine's intelligence, educational background, and sophisticated understanding of social issues challenged every stereotype I had absorbed about racial differences and capabilities. She was not only academically accomplished, but also deeply committed to improving educational opportunities for Black children in Mississippi, despite knowing that her research might never be implemented due to the state's commitment to maintaining segregated and unequal school systems. Over the following weeks, I found excuses to help Josephine with her research, gradually earning her trust and discovering that she was far more knowledgeable about literature, history, and social theory than most of the white students I knew, including myself. Our study sessions evolved into genuine intellectual collaboration and then into personal conversations that revealed her hopes, fears, and dreams for a future where her race wouldn't limit her opportunities or endanger her life simply for seeking education and equality. "Timothy," she said during one of our evening study sessions, using my full name with a formality that reflected both respect and the social distance that racial conventions required. "You seem like a decent person, but you need to understand what you're risking by associating with me. White students who are seen as sympathetic to civil rights face social ostracism, academic pressure, and sometimes physical violence. And Black students who are seen as getting too comfortable with white allies face suspicion from their own community and increased harassment from white supremacists." Her warning was both practical and prophetic, but I had already begun to fall in love with her intelligence, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to justice, despite the personal costs she faced daily. The more time I spent with Josephine, the more I understood that everything I had been taught about racial differences was not only wrong, but designed to justify a system of oppression that denied the humanity and potential of millions of people based solely on the color of their skin. Before you continue this powerful journey of love, courage, and moral awakening with us, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about the individuals who risked everything to stand up for love and justice during America's most challenging historical moments. The transition from intellectual collaboration to romantic attraction was gradual but inevitable, as I discovered that Josephine possessed not only the academic excellence that I admired, but also qualities of character that made her the most remarkable person I had ever known. Her dedication to improving conditions for Black children, despite knowing that her efforts might never be recognized or rewarded. Her ability to maintain dignity and grace in the face of daily humiliation and discrimination. And her unwavering faith in the possibility of positive change inspired me to examine my own values and commitments. The first time I asked Josephine to meet me somewhere other than the library, suggesting we continue our conversation over coffee at a restaurant near campus, her response revealed the practical dangers that surrounded any attempt at interracial socializing in 1964 Mississippi. "Timothy, there isn't a restaurant in this entire state where we could sit together without risking arrest, violence, or worse," she explained patiently. "Interracial couples are not just socially unacceptable here. They're criminally illegal and physically dangerous. Are you prepared for what it would mean to be seen publicly with a Black woman?" The reality check forced me to confront how sheltered and naive I had been about the practical implications of developing feelings for someone whose race made our relationship not just unconventional, but literally against the law. Mississippi's anti-miscegenation statutes prohibited interracial marriage and could be used to prosecute couples for any form of intimate relationship, while social custom enforced these legal restrictions through economic pressure, social ostracism, and the ever-present threat of violence from both official law enforcement and unofficial vigilante groups. Despite these dangers, Josephine and I began meeting secretly in locations where we were unlikely to be seen by anyone who might report us to authorities or threaten our safety. We would drive to remote areas outside Jackson, meet at the homes of sympathetic civil rights activists who provided safe spaces for interracial gatherings, or simply walk through Black neighborhoods where our presence together wouldn't attract the same kind of hostile attention it would receive in white areas of the city. These clandestine meetings revealed the depth of our mutual attraction and the strength of our shared commitment to challenging the racial barriers that were designed to keep us apart. Our conversations ranged from academic discussions about literature and history to intimate sharing of our hopes, fears, and dreams for a future where love might be stronger than hate, and where individual character might matter more than racial classification. "I never thought I could fall in love with a white man," Josephine admitted during one of our evening walks through her neighborhood. "But you're helping me understand that maybe the problem isn't race itself, but the way race has been used to prevent us from seeing each other as complete human beings." The deepening of our relationship throughout the summer and fall of 1964 coincided with escalating civil rights activity throughout Mississippi, as Freedom Summer brought hundreds of volunteers to the state to register black voters and challenge the systems of oppression that had maintained white supremacy since Reconstruction. The murders of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner in Philadelphia, Mississippi, demonstrated the lethal risks faced by anyone who challenged racial orthodoxy, while the ongoing violence against civil rights workers made clear that interracial relationships were seen as particularly threatening to the established order. The intensity of the political climate made our secret relationship both more dangerous and more meaningful, as we recognized that our love represented exactly the kind of human connection that segregationists were fighting to prevent. Every moment we spent together was an act of rebellion against laws and customs designed to maintain racial separation, while every conversation we shared challenged assumptions about racial differences that justified the entire system of Jim Crow oppression. The first serious threat to our relationship came when a white student who had seen us together in the library reported his suspicions to university administrators, leading to informal pressure on both of us to end our association. Josephine was called into meetings with black faculty members who warned her that being seen as too friendly with white students could jeopardize her academic standing and her safety, while I received visits from white fraternity brothers who made it clear that continuing to associate with black students would result in social ostracism and possible expulsion from organizations that I had considered important to my college experience. "Tim," my fraternity president told me during what was framed as a friendly conversation but felt like an interrogation, "we've heard some disturbing rumors about you spending time with colored students in ways that go beyond what's appropriate for research collaboration. You need to understand that this kind of behavior reflects badly on the entire fraternity and could create problems for all of us with the university administration and the community. We're hoping you'll make better choices about your associations." The pressure from my peer group was intense, but nothing compared to the reaction I received when word of my relationship with Josephine reached my family through the network of gossip and surveillance that characterized Mississippi's white community. My father summoned me home for a weekend that would prove to be the beginning of the end of my relationship with the only family I had ever known, as Patrick Walsh made clear that no son of his would be permitted to disgrace the family name through association with black individuals in any context that suggested social equality. "Timothy," my father began, his voice carrying the controlled anger that I had learned to fear throughout my childhood, "I've received some very disturbing reports about your behavior at the university. Please tell me that these stories about you socializing with Negro students are exaggerated or taken out of context, because if they're true, you're endangering not only your own future, but the reputation and business interests of this entire family." The conversation that followed was one of the most painful of my life, as I watched my father's disappointment and anger escalate when I refused to disavow my relationship with Josephine or promise to end my involvement with civil rights issues. Patrick Walsh was not just a racist. He was a man whose financial success and social standing depended on maintaining the approval of clients and community leaders who viewed racial integration as a threat to their economic interests and political power. "Son, you don't understand what you're throwing away," he continued, his voice rising with frustration and genuine bewilderment that his son could reject the values that had shaped the Walsh family for generations. "I've spent 25 years building a law practice that could provide you with everything a man could want. Financial security, social respect, political influence. But all of that depends on maintaining the trust and approval of the people who matter in this state. And those people will never accept a lawyer whose loyalty to his own race is questionable." My mother's reaction was equally devastating, but expressed through tears and emotional manipulation rather than anger and threats. Catherine Walsh had devoted her life to maintaining the family's social position and could not comprehend why her son would voluntarily sacrifice the privileges and opportunities that she had worked so hard to secure for him. "Timothy, honey, you're breaking my heart," she pleaded, her voice thick with emotion and incomprehension. "This isn't who you are. You're a Walsh, from a good Southern family with a proud heritage. This Negro girl has filled your head with communist propaganda and turned you against your own people. But it's not too late to come to your senses and remember who you really are and what you owe to your family and your heritage." The ultimatum that followed was delivered with the cold precision of a legal document, as my father outlined exactly what would happen if I continued my relationship with Josephine or remained involved with civil rights activities. "Timothy, you have a choice to make," he announced. "You can end this inappropriate relationship, transfer to a different university where you'll be removed from negative influences, and prepare to join the family law practice as we've always planned. Or you can continue down this destructive path and face the consequences of choosing outsiders over your own family." The consequences he outlined were comprehensive and devastating. Complete financial cutoff, removal from the family will, social ostracism from the Jackson community, and active efforts to damage my reputation and career prospects throughout Mississippi. "If you choose to side with the Negroes against your own people," my father concluded, "then you'll discover very quickly how difficult life can be without the advantages that being a Walsh has always provided you." The pressure to conform to my family's expectations was enormous, representing not just the loss of financial security, but the destruction of every relationship and social connection that had defined my identity throughout my childhood and adolescence. The comfortable future that had been planned for me, law school, marriage to an appropriate Southern belle, partnership in my father's firm, and leadership roles in Jackson's white elite, would disappear completely if I chose love over loyalty to racial orthodoxy. But the weeks I had spent with Josephine had shown me a different way of understanding success, fulfillment, and moral responsibility. Her commitment to improving conditions for Black children, despite knowing that her efforts might never be rewarded, her ability to maintain dignity and hope in the face of systematic oppression, and her unwavering belief in the possibility of a more just society had inspired me to examine my own values and priorities in ways that made my family's ultimatum feel like a test of my character, rather than a reasonable request for family loyalty. "I love Josephine Williams," I told my parents during our final conversation before I left their house forever. "And I'm going to continue supporting civil rights regardless of the cost to me personally. I understand that this means losing your approval and your financial support, but I'd rather be poor and honest than wealthy and complicit in maintaining a system that treats people like Josephine as less than human simply because of their race." The silence that followed my declaration was more devastating than any argument or threat could have been. As I watched my parents realize that their son had chosen principles over pragmatism and love over social acceptance. The look of disappointment and incomprehension in my mother's eyes, combined with the cold anger in my father's expression, made clear that this conversation was not just an argument about my relationship choices, but the end of my membership in the Walsh family and the privileged white community that had shaped my entire life. The drive back to the university was the longest 2 hours of my life, as I processed the reality that I had just given up everything I had previously considered important: family relationships, financial security, social status, and professional prospects, for a love that remained dangerous and uncertain. The man who had driven to Jackson as Patrick Walsh's son and heir returned to campus as Timothy Walsh, the race traitor, facing an uncertain future with only his principles and his love for Josephine to sustain him through the challenges that lay ahead. The months that followed my break with my family were the most difficult and most transformative of my young life, as I learned to navigate a world where my whiteness no longer provided automatic advantages, but where my commitment to racial justice remained suspect to many in the Black community who had been betrayed by well-meaning white allies before. The financial hardship was immediate and severe. Without my father's support, I had to find work to pay for tuition, housing, and basic necessities while maintaining my academic performance and continuing my relationship with Josephine under increasingly dangerous circumstances. The job I found washing dishes at a Black-owned restaurant in Jackson provided me with my first extended exposure to the African American community as something other than an observer or occasional visitor. Working alongside black men who had been denied educational and economic opportunities because of their race gave me a visceral understanding of how the system of segregation affected real families and individual lives in ways that my academic study of civil rights had never conveyed. "You're that white boy who's been seeing Josephine Williams," observed Moses Jefferson, the restaurant's cook, during my first week of work. "Folks are wondering what your real intentions are. Whether you're serious about standing with us or just playing around until you get tired of slumming and go back to your comfortable white life." His skepticism was understandable and entirely justified, given the history of white activists who had participated in civil rights work as a form of temporary adventure before returning to the privileges and security of white society. The process of proving my genuine commitment to racial justice and my authentic love for Josephine required patience, consistency, and a willingness to accept that trust had to be earned through actions rather than declared through words. The black community in Jackson had experienced too many betrayals by white allies who had abandoned the movement when the costs became too high or the novelty wore off. My willingness to sacrifice my family relationships and economic security for my principles was noted, but not immediately accepted as proof of permanent commitment. Josephine's response to my break with my family was complicated, as she felt simultaneously grateful for my sacrifice and guilty about the role our relationship had played in destroying my connections with my parents and childhood community. "Timothy, I never wanted to be the reason you lost your family," she said during one of our conversations about the implications of my choice. "A man should be able to love who he chooses without having to give up everything else that matters to him. The fact that you had to make that choice just proves how sick this society really is." The danger we faced as an interracial couple intensified after my public break with my family made our relationship impossible to hide any longer. Word spread quickly through Mississippi's white community that Patrick Walsh's son had chosen a black woman over his family heritage, making us targets for violence from white supremacist groups who saw our relationship as a particularly provocative challenge to racial orthodoxy. The first direct threat came in the form of a burning cross on the lawn of the house where I was renting a room, accompanied by a note that made clear that continued association with Josephine would result in escalating violence. "We know about you and your nigger girlfriend," the note read. "End this disgraceful relationship now, or face the consequences of betraying your own race." The crude language and explicit threats forced us to take additional precautions about when and where we met, while also making clear that our love was seen as a political act that threatened the entire system of racial separation. The decision to leave Mississippi became inevitable when we learned that the Ku Klux Klan was actively planning violence against us, and that local law enforcement could not be trusted to provide protection for an interracial couple who were seen as troublemakers and agitators. "We have to go somewhere where we can build a life together without constantly fearing for our safety," Josephine said during one of our discussions about the future. "I love my work here, and I hate giving up on the children who need better educational opportunities. But we can't help anyone if we're dead or in prison." Our destination was Detroit, where the automotive industry provided economic opportunities for both black workers and white allies of the civil rights movement, and where the urban environment offered more anonymity and acceptance for interracial couples than was possible in the rural South. The journey north was itself an education in the geography of American racism, as we discovered that prejudice and discrimination were not uniquely Southern phenomena, but took different forms in different regions. The wedding ceremony that Josephine and I held in Detroit in the spring of 1965 was both a celebration of our love and a political statement about the possibility of human connection across racial boundaries. The service was conducted by Reverend James Washington, a black minister who had been active in the civil rights movement, and attended by a racially mixed group of activists, unionists, and community organizers who had supported us through the difficult transition from Mississippi to Michigan. "Today we celebrate not just the union of Timothy and Josephine," Reverend Washington declared, "but the triumph of love over hate, of justice over oppression, and of human connection over the artificial barriers that racism has created to keep God's children separated from each other." And the ceremony represented everything that my family and former community had rejected. The possibility that love could transcend racial boundaries and that America could become a society where character mattered more than color. The absence of my family from our wedding was painful, but expected, as they had maintained their position that my relationship with Josephine was a betrayal of everything they had taught me about proper behavior and racial loyalty. The last communication I received from my father was a brief letter informing me that I had been permanently removed from his will, and that the Walsh family no longer acknowledged my existence. The life that Josephine and I built together in Detroit was challenging, but fulfilling in ways that my privileged upbringing had never prepared me to appreciate. Working in an automobile factory while completing my education at Wayne State University, I learned skills and developed perspectives that my sheltered background had never provided. Josephine found work as a teacher in Detroit's public school system, where she could finally pursue her commitment to improving educational opportunities for black children without the systematic obstruction she had faced in Mississippi. The personal growth I experienced through my marriage to Josephine and my integration into Detroit's civil rights community was profound and ongoing, as I continued to examine and challenge the assumptions about race, privilege, and social responsibility that my upbringing had instilled. The comfortable certainties of white supremacy had been replaced by a more complex but more honest understanding of American society and my role in working toward justice and equality. The children we raised together, 3 beautiful, intelligent kids who inherited both their mother's strength and their father's stubborn commitment to principle, grew up in a world that was gradually becoming more accepting of interracial families, but still required them to navigate questions of identity and belonging that children from single-race families never had to face. You have to be proud of all aspects of your heritage, I would tell them, while understanding that some people will try to use your mixed background to make you feel like you don't belong anywhere. But you belong everywhere that love and justice are valued. The gradual reconciliation with my mother, which began tentatively in the early 1970s when she reached out after my father's death, provided an opportunity for healing that I had never expected to experience. Her letter acknowledging that she missed her son and wanted to meet her grandchildren represented a victory of family love over racial prejudice that gave me hope for broader social change. "Timothy, I may never fully understand the choices you made," she wrote. "But I've come to realize that losing my son was a price too high to pay for maintaining social approval. If your wife and children are important to you, then maybe it's time for me to learn to see them as the family they've always been." The reunion was emotional and imperfect, but it demonstrated that even deeply ingrained racial attitudes could sometimes be overcome by the persistent power of love and human connection. Looking back on the decision that cost me my family and my inheritance, but gave me a life of meaning and authentic love, I understand that choosing Josephine over racial conformity was the most important decision I ever made. The comfortable future that had been planned for me in my father's law firm would have required me to participate in maintaining systems of oppression that denied the humanity and dignity of people like my wife and children. The man who was disowned for dating a black woman during the civil rights era ultimately found a life of greater purpose, deeper love, and more authentic success than anything my privileged background could have provided. Josephine and I proved that love truly could overcome racial hatred when individuals were willing to sacrifice comfort and security for principle and truth. Our marriage became part of the larger transformation that gradually made America a more just and inclusive society, demonstrating that interracial love was not only possible, but could produce families and communities stronger and more beautiful than anything segregation could create. The sacrifice of my inheritance was temporary, while the love and wisdom I gained through choosing justice over privilege has lasted a lifetime, and will continue through our children and grandchildren who carry forward the values we fought to establish.